For anyone out there thinking of buying a small yacht and keeping it in the UK, I thought I'd just put together some clips of what it was like having skullduggery in Scarborough. If you didn't see our last video, skullduggery was a 23-foot SK700 that we bought in August 2019 but have now sold. We kept skullduggery in the outer harbour in a cradle, which meant we couldn't just walk out on a pontoon to her. If we wanted to go out at low tide to do some work on her, we needed to walk out. For us, the best way meant walking through a small section of ankle-deep mud to get to the sandbank in front of her, as everything behind her was mud. We were lucky that someone had already done a good job of building this cradle along with a handy ladder. To get to her when the tide was in, we had to row out in our little tender. We kept ours padlocked to this floating pontoon, but it meant it filled with water every time it rained. We tied a milk bottle to it so we always had a means of emptying the water out, and often we would come down even when we weren't going out sailing just to empty the water out. Ours never got to the point where it was even half full, but we saw other people's get very full, and one even sank. But it was fine. The owner must have rescued it at low tide because we saw it floating again a few days later. Rowing out could sometimes be a good arm workout if we were rowing against the wind, but then on the way back to the pontoon we'd just have to steer, no rowing needed. Apart from the considerably cheaper berthing fees, the other benefit of being in a drying harbour was the fact that anti-fouling her was free. As in, we didn't have to pay to either move her somewhere to dry out or have her lifted out. We just waited for a spring tide, with low tide and daylight, we were both free, and it wasn't raining, so quite a rare occasion. A spring tide is when the moon is new or full, so the gravitational pull on Earth's waters are strongest, giving really low tides. This meant we could walk out as the tide was still on its way out, paint her with anti-foul, and walk back before the tide reached her again. The anti-foul was given to us from the owner of the yacht we race on, Takazar, so that was free as well. It was white, and he anti-fouls his boat in red, so we had no use for it, and although skullduggery had been painted blue before, we think she looked good in white. Boats need to be anti-fouled to stop marine life like algae and barnacles from growing on the hull. These can massively reduce the boat's performance and reduce fuel efficiency of motoring. The anti-foul works by releasing biocides, which stop organisms attaching to the bottom of the boat. Many anti-fouls contain copper, which in high enough concentrations can be toxic to some marine life. This mostly happens near marinas, where people blast or scrape the old anti-foul off before applying the new coat, meaning concentrated amounts of copper can build up in sediments near marinas. This wasn't an issue for us. Because skullduggery dries out, very little algae could survive on her anyway, so there was no need to blast or scrape her clean. We just painted over the old anti-foul. To be honest, if we weren't selling her, we wouldn't have completely painted her, we'd have just patched up the bits that had worn off, because the old anti-foul was still doing its job. Algae was only really growing where the anti-foul had worn away. When we anti-foul our new yacht, Sareda, we'll make sure to do it at a facility that captures the runoff when anti-fouling, preventing it from polluting the sea. There is a lot of research going into creating anti-foul paint that doesn't contain metals though. We just had old paintbrushes to anti-foul skullduggery, so I think it took longer to paint her than it would have if we'd had rollers, but we still managed to finish with plenty of time to spare. We weren't sure if we'd have enough paint to finish the job, so we worked from the bottom up in stages, working our way gradually higher all the way around the boat. We also forgot to bring masking tape down with us to finish it by getting a perfect line against the stripe of blue, so we had to leave her unfinished. There's a price to pay for cheap berthing and free anti-fouling though, and one of the most annoying problems we encountered being in a drying harbour was bird poop. In the first few weeks of owning skullduggery, it was in summer with light evenings and lovely weather, so we were going out sailing often, but every single time we came down to the harbour, even if it was daily, the deck would be covered in poo and mangled crabs' bodies. We think the birds would forage in the mud of the harbour bottom at low tide and then eat what they'd found and rest on the boats at high tide. We spent so much time cleaning her, and this was quite an essential task, because if we didn't, our hands and whatever we were wearing would get covered in bird poo when we were sailing. In this video you can see me scrubbing away at the deck and Liam trying unsuccessfully to fix the engine. Liam unfortunately lost our bucket. It sank to the bottom of the harbour and was not to be found at low tide, so cleaning became an even longer task until we thought to borrow a bucket from a friendly boat neighbour James, who has a lovely yellow yacht called Pandemonium. When we finished, we went over to Pandemonium for a cup of tea, and I spotted a jellyfish while Liam tied the tender to James's cradle. The engine was working fine until the beginning of November, when we had planned to take my dad out sailing. We'd planned a sunrise sail, so he'd driven over to ours the night before and slept on our sofa bed. We'd got up in the dark and been down at the harbour for first light. We got everything set up and ready to go and radioed the harbour master to open the bridge, but ended up not going out. The problem with the engine was that it would start and run at high revs, but cut out at low revs. We needed it to run at low revs for getting in and out of the berth and harbour, so we couldn't go sailing until it was fixed. Asking around at the yacht club, we were advised it was probably dirt in the carburettor, so we attempted to get to it and spray it with carburettor cleaner. We also changed the spark plug. That unfortunately made no difference, so we decided to take the engine off skullduggery to make it easier to work on. It was padlocked on by the previous owner, and we didn't have a key, so we had to get it off with an angle grinder. We took it to Liam's dad's workshop, and while Liam was at work, his dad, Richard, and I took it apart and cleaned it. There was a substantial layer of gunk inside the carburettor, so I cleaned that out. When we put it back together, it worked fine. So the lesson learnt from that is if someone sells you a yacht with a jerry can of fuel, just dispose of it and buy some fresh, clean fuel. We're back on skullduggery. We've hopefully got the engine completely working now, so we're just going to try and see if it works now that it's back on the boat. idling. Let it idle. Because that was the problem before, is it wouldn't idle.
There you go.
We fixed it!
Well, I didn't. You did it while I was at work.
Me and Richard Thraves fixed it. Yay, thank you, Richard Thraves. Another problem we encountered was misjudging the tide. One day we were in such a rush to get out to Skullduggery, do some work and get back because we had a race that afternoon. When we got down to the harbour, the tide was further out than we'd expected. My genius plan was to carry our tender to Skullduggery and row it back when the tide was on its way in. However, we got part of the way and ended up having to get in the tender and wait for the tide and row the rest of the way. We must have looked like such idiots to anyone watching, but we did save a bit of time. We didn't have to wait too long before our little tender was floating and we managed to row to Skullduggery. We got mud all over Skullduggery, so we had to give her a quick clean, and saw a random firework in the process. We came down at another time and gave the tender a clean. It was quite gross anyway, with algae growing in it. Keeping a yacht in the UK, particularly on the northeast coast, means winter can bring some very strong winds and storms, so you have to be very confident in your moorings. Although we were confident in Skullduggery's cradle and moorings, we would always come down to the harbour in strong winds to check she was okay. We'd also check on other people's boats and know that when they came down to the harbour, they'd let us know if they saw anything wrong with Skullduggery. You can't really tell from this video how windy it is, but it was forecast over 60 miles per hour. Thanks for watching. I hope this was useful to people. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up.